Well, good evening. I am Yolanda Johnson. I am a facilitator for the Oncology Foundation of Maryland and DC. Welcome to Critical Conversations, a cancer learning series. This session is hosted by the Oncology Foundation of Maryland and DC that we love to call OFMDC. The mission of OFMDC is to bring together in a non-competing way patients, patient advocates, doctors, and the research industry to provide education and information on available cancer resources at no cost. This is forum number 2 of the learning series, Clinical Trials Through the Patient Lens with Dina George Lansey. We are very fortunate to have Dina join us today. But before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, if you could place in chat your name and where you're joining us from. Thank you all who have already done so at this time. Just to give you a little bit about Dina, Dina George Lansey is an MSN and an RN at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. Dina is the Assistant Director for Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Research, and she's also the Deputy Associate Director for Community Outreach and Engagement at the Sidney Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center. Dina is also an assistant professor of oncology at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So Dina, you are a busy woman, so we are very grateful to have you this evening. Thank you for being here. Dina, let's just open it up with, how did you get into all of this work?
You know, it is still a little bit weird to have somebody read those long, ridiculous at some point titles that they just seem to go on and on, because I think once you're an oncology nurse, you're always an oncology nurse. They can layer on other titles, but I started as a peds oncology nurse with the intent that I would stay at Hopkins for 1 year, but if they let me do peds oncology, that would be all there was, and I loved it. And there were some folks that were cheerleaders that got me to move to adult oncology, where I found them to be slightly whinier than the kids. Kids are we're so much easier, and people always immediately responded with, it's so sad. And then how do you do it? And then you move on to adults, and those patients are people who remind you of your parents and your family members, and it is equally hard and rewarding. But taking care of both peds and adult patients receiving standard of care therapy just made me want more and more to be a part of moving cancer science forward, to be a part of new therapies, whether those were drugs or devices or just a way to manage better side effects from therapies that they were receiving. So I became a research nurse in 2002 and moved into different roles in the cancer center over the years. And now I'm privileged to be able to continue that work and work with research nurses and investigators and try to figure out how we can make those trial opportunities to have access to the most advanced therapies that we have accessible to everybody. So you should be able to have access to those therapies no matter where you live, no matter what gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status or awareness and understanding of how trials work when you come to us. So it is a long-winded answer to go with those long titles, but I love the work, if that is all of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I can tell you love the work. We've spent some time together over these past several weeks, and it's good to know that there is someone out there like you doing this work from the patient's perspective and providing this level of education. One of the things that was really important to us is that the audience really had a basic understanding of clinical trials. What is it, Dina? What is clinical trials? Let's start there, and then we'll move the conversation along.
Clinical trials are studies that are done with humans so that we can understand better how to identify and understand how diseases work, be able to detect them sooner, and find therapies for them.
Awesome. And how do they come about? As someone like me, I have gotten things in my emails to participate in clinical trials. So how does all of this process work? Take us from like what happens that it does before it gets to the patient or a potential patient.
So there are different types of research studies. For the answer to your question, we'll talk about what that looks like when it is a therapeutic drug study. So long before there is a clinical trial where we enroll participants, patients, there's a lot of bench work, so lab science work that happens before we have enough information that says what the bench scientists saw in their labs seemed promising enough that it should be moved forward to human studies. So that could be decades of work that happens before we end up in what sounds potentially more familiar to folks on the call, and that is the phases that a drug has to go through before the FDA approves it for use. So it will just in snippets of explanations for how those phases work. So we've moved from the laboratory and scientists identifying promising therapies. The first phase that we enroll patients in would be a phase 1 study. And the goal of a phase 1 study is for us to understand the safety of that drug, learn things about side effects, and then to understand what's the best way to give that drug. What schedule should it be given on? So how many times a day do you take it? In addition to what should the dose be? So sometimes you may hear a phase 1 study referred to as a dose finding study. Dose finding and safety are the two key points of a phase 1 study. And what dose finding looks like, and these are studies that happen with a smaller number of participants than in any other phase. So as an example, a dose finding phase 1 study may enroll 3 patients at 1 dose. And then you would find out how they fare in that. So you might go on to this study and then a month goes by, 1 full cycle of a dose schedule. We are looking at side effects, and it is important that participants in those studies are telling us things about how they feel. Nothing is too small to report, but there are lots of people on the research team and your clinical providers looking to make sure that you are safe. So those 3 people would be watched before we enroll more, which is why those studies tend to enroll much fewer patients. So less than 50 patients would be on a phase 1 study. When you move to phase 2, now we've learned from the phase 1 study some of the side effects that were reported there. We know what we're looking for. We will continue to look for those. It is always about safety when drugs are moving through the phases. And then we're looking for effectiveness in a phase 2 study. Is there a response in a tumor for a cancer patient of a particular disease of focus for that study at that dose with that drug? And then there's phase 3. So sorry, I'll step back to the phase 2, more patients than the phase 1 study that may have 100 patients, potentially a couple hundred patients. In a phase 3 study, now we've moved and we know what the dose should be. We understand the dose schedule. We know a lot about the side effects that patients in the phase 1 and 2 have experienced. And now we want to know, is this better? This drug better than what we already have? So you compare it to the standard of care at the time, the gold standard, whatever that is, to find out whether or not this new drug is more effective, better tolerated. And then you go back to the FDA because you've reported out things that have happened along the way to get this drug approved. And a phase 3 study is hundreds, thousands, potentially of patients. And finally, a phase 4 drug study is a drug that's already approved, but we are continuing to learn. So things you would look for in a phase 4 study are things that need time. So if someone is on a drug for a certain amount of time, there are things we can see during the phase 1 through 3, but longer term side effects, tolerance, things like that are what's collected in a phase 4 study.
Dina, that's awesome, because there may be someone on the call with us or someone who's going to listen to this later on that somehow thinks that clinical trials or medicines just kind of happen, right? And they happen and they just show up. But you just described to us 4 different levels, as I see them, of dosing and safety and effectiveness, and then continued learning. I think that's really important for people to know, because there are folks who are kind of fearful or hesitant when it comes to clinical trials. And even with all of this information, do people still have reason to be hesitant based on what you're seeing, from patients? Are they hesitant, and what are the reasons that they're explaining to you about the things that makes them kind of be reluctant to participate in a trial?
No, I think it is worth saying to remind people that as we just reviewed those phases of studies, every single drug that is being used now for cancer patients in other diseases all had to go through those phases of study. So, and there were people who were willing to volunteer, healthy volunteers that were in a phase 1 study for a new drug, cancer patients along the way who were willing to participate in these studies, not knowing whether or not there would be benefit for them, although that is always the hope. I will thread through the conversation the way I started. I'm an oncology nurse from the beginning. I know exactly what those phases of studies are and what the goal of a study is. But when you take care of patients, your hope is always the same, whether it was a phase 1 study or a phase 3 study. I'm hoping that the patient that has just enrolled in a clinical trial that I was the research nurse for receives some benefit. It is what we all hope for. But it is important to understand when you are offered enrollment in a clinical trial, whether or not it's right for you. And I think being hesitant about whether or not to participate can come in many forms, all valid reasons. And there is a great deal of research that goes on to try to understand why people who might have an available trial declines. And they look at it from all different angles. Mm-hmm. There is a great deal of literature that studies why African-American participants seem to say no in greater numbers. It might be why are women underrepresented? But these aren't monolithic groups. So when it comes to a decision about a clinical trial, and particularly in a forum like this to discuss it, I think that we have to be mindful that it is an understanding of how clinical trials work, those phases we just talked about. It is also important to understand how you are protected if you were to become a clinical trial participant. Things like that I've heard from patients over the years is that someone might be fearful because they think that they could receive a study drug, an investigational therapy, without their permission. And we can't do that. But that means there's a flag there for me that says that we should make sure that they understand how the informed consent process works, which is how do we tell you about a clinical trial? How do we help you see in black and white and in conversation what the benefits and the potential risk are for you and what will be expected if you're on the study? It is important that people understand that not only can't you be enrolled in a clinical trial without your permission, but if you gave your permission at any time, you can say, no, I don't want to do it anymore. It doesn't fit in my life. These side effects are miserable. I'm too tired. It can be any reason, big or small. You just decided you don't want to do it anymore. And you would be taken off of that clinical trial with your clinical team and the research team, making sure that you are safe. So you don't want to take the drug anymore. They really want to make sure that you are feeling okay and side effects are managed, but you would then be able to discuss with your care team what other treatment options are available to you. You are not bound by that single yes and commitment to participating. But it is important too, again, this comment that I've made about it fitting into your life. So if you understand your right to say yes or no, to you have the support you need from your clinical team and the research team to evaluate what is being asked of you and if you would like to do that or not. But does it fit into your life in terms of, is the schedule of visits for that clinical trial so intense that you are working and you would have to take time off from work? And that's not something that you're able to do or want to do. I've had people decline over that in fact, that they did not think the added burden of those visits outweighed the things that they had happening in their life, work, family, quality of life, or just personal interest, that they did not want to spend the required amount of time in the clinic or going back and forth to the clinic. So there are lots of moving parts in whether or not someone chooses to do it and whether or not that's always because they're hesitant. You know, it's I think a lot more complicated than that. But I do think sometimes there are patients who might be deemed hesitant and unwilling when in fact it's some of the other reasons that I've shared.
Absolutely. I love that because it helps the folks who have joined us who work with patients or who are patient advocates really think about the things related to explaining the phases. This is what I heard, and then we'll reiterate this together. Clearly explaining the different phases in the process to the patients, but also explaining informed consent to them. What does that look like? Thinking about that time commitment from the patient's perspective and what their life looks like and how this fits into their life. And then also understanding that not all patients are not monolithic. You know, we don't show up as one thing. Can you add to that part? And then also add to any other tips that you think that people need to know to get them to understand clinical trials through the patient's lens.
We are constantly discussing low participation in clinical trials. When we look at overall adult cancer patient participation in trials, it's ranged between 3 and 8% of adult cancer patients enroll in a clinical trial. When you start to parse out that already tiny percentage and think about how many of those folks are older adults, how many are women, how many are minority patients, how many are LGBTQ, so now, or other groups, how many live in rural areas and have a difficult time getting to cancer centers that offer clinical trials. So it's a lot of discussion about diversity and inclusion in participation in clinical trials. And as we have those conversations, I think that it lends itself to us trying to the comment that struck a chord with you, that they're not monolithic groups, that we are not so focused on the number and percentage of patients who participate in trials that we lose sight of educating patients as they come to us, meeting them wherever they are. But we need to try to level the understanding of clinical trials so that they are deemed as a treatment option versus a last ditch effort. So if you meet me as a new patient and we make sure that we have some understanding of how we deliver treatment option information and that you are positioned well to be able to evaluate those choices, then I think it removes some of the stigma that is attached to clinical trials. It needs to be seen as a treatment option versus we have nothing else for you. And now we're going to talk about clinical trials. So we try to make sure that our investigators and our clinical teams are having those discussions early and often, because you could be approached for participation in a treatment trial, but it is as important to what we learn about how to identify variations in specific cancers. So those are tumor markers, or how a particular tumor behaves. But on the other end of the spectrum, because we often only focus on drug therapy trials or device trials, how do you manage your side effects? There have been studies that I've worked with that were things like tea tree oil for nail beds, because a side effect of a certain therapy made those nail beds sensitive or caused nail issues. And we wanted to see if tea tree oil helped. So sometimes the understanding, the groundwork being laid for patients and families and patient advocates to understand how clinical trials work and research studies work means that you are ready to receive a potential offer, whether it's a quality of life study, a survey study, a blood specimen collection study where you might volunteer to have a blood sample taken that ends up in a biobank, so we can try to understand how a disease behaves across a period of time. It's a wide range of what clinical research looks like.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Dina, is there anything that you can share that you all are doing? Maybe a practical process or a tip or something that you all are doing at your site to help, address or encourage the patients when it comes to clinical trials?
My work is mostly focused on trying to identify barriers to participation, and then how do we respond to those? So one effort I will share with you is one that I started in 2013. And, lots of my colleagues looked at me like I had two heads, because it wasn't information that we were collecting, and it wasn't at that time easy to collect. But we have lots of discussions about clinical trials, and some of them aren't captured unless the patient says yes. So if the patient says yes, that informed consent process that I mentioned earlier starts. And ultimately, a written document and a consent form is signed. And we collect lots of information then. I know demographics, and I know which clinical trial, and it starts the process of data collection as you are participating in that trial. What we often miss is, if you are my doctor and you talk to me about a clinical trial and I say, no, I'm not interested at all, and I don't move on to sign the consent document, I don't know why you said no. And I was very interested in clinical trial candidates who declined, because I think they are the closest we can get to people who maybe have not made the decision to come into our cancer center to receive therapy. They are the closest from the inside of the cancer center that I can get to community members who maybe have family members who have a diagnosis, but they themselves don't. How do we begin to understand what the misunderstanding is, or what some of the needs are? So the thought was, if we collect this candidate information every time we had a discussion of 5 minutes or more about a clinical trial, and you don't move on to consent, and I know why, then I might be able to do something with it. So from 2013, when we started collecting the information, and through 2015, there were about 2,700 conversations about clinical trials. Some of them are repeated patients. They may have had a discussion about 3 trials and picked one, but I don't know why they turned down the other 2. One common reason that we saw back then is one that gets a lot of discussion now as a barrier, a valid and really important barrier to trials, is transportation. So the cancer center is too far. I don't have a way to get there. But some of the reasons we saw in those candidate declines was that there were too many visits. It's too expensive. Parking on our campus is not free. So that was an additional barrier. I think for the first time, we looked much closer to understand that distance doesn't always mean it's hard for you to get to Baltimore from DC or Virginia or someplace else. It also means it could be hard for you to get to us from West Baltimore to our East Baltimore campus because public transportation is tough to navigate in Baltimore City. So we developed a transportation study. And that study pays for parking from the point that you are a trial candidate. So that means you can come in and talk to your doctor or nurse as many times as you'd like so that you can try to make a decision. If you decide to sign the consent form, we would continue paying for parking for up to a year after you were on that study. But if you lived in Baltimore City, we'd pay for taxi transportation. And it was taxi transportation because that study predates Uber having a business platform that would let us have an account with them to support that study. But now there've been 850 patients since 2015 on this study. So it's one that I am proud of because it removed a barrier, but it also allowed patients who had discussions to make a decision, to think about it as long as they wanted to think about it, as long as the bounds of their disease and the trial windows let them do it, but they weren't under pressure to worry about visits and parking and things like that from the decision point through trying to find out whether or not they were eligible and then ultimately enroll if they chose to. But if they chose not to, then the parking was done for the time that it was being considered and they were not required to do anything or pay anything back. So
that's awesome. I think that's awesome. And I'm sure that some other folks on the line may be able to relate to that or maybe even possibly implement the same type of study and maybe determine the barrier like that. I'd love to take some time to hear from the folks who are on the call with us to see if you have any questions or thoughts, or what are some of the things that you're seeing in your area, some of the barriers that you all are seeing. Feel free to take yourself off mute. We actually want to hear from you.
I feel better when I hear.
Yeah, we want to hear from you and dialogue with you all.
This is Pam Pyro. Hi there. I have a question on ghost trials. Basically, not a question, but can you touch on those? You know, when there's part of the trial is blind, and when is that used, and what would be the implications for a patient to consider?
Blind or placebo trial?
Well, placebo. That would be a better word for it, Dina. Thank you.
So placebo trials, are often questioned because that is one of the reasons people give as a reason to decline for a trial, because they are worried that they will either be receiving a treatment or no treatment for their cancer, which doesn't happen. So I can tell you in a phase 1 study, we don't use a placebo. Where you are more likely to see it is in 2 or 3, and most often in 3. And it is typically with a combination of, as an example, in a phase 2 study, we might have a colon cancer patient, and there is a standard of care, a regimen of drugs that's given to a particular stage of colon cancer, and they would receive that therapy. In a clinical trial with a randomization and, let's say, a new pill that is the study drug, the randomization would be for both groups of patients to receive the standard of care. One receives this new pill drug, and it's the actual drug, and one is the placebo. And it is to find out whether or not the study drug, the new pill, is more effective in combination with the regimen of drugs we're already using. So it is not you get treated or not. It is treatment plus or treatment, and that's where the placebo comparison comes in. But patients are not ever given less than what is the standard of care. Another place that I can think of that, and it was actually a trial like this that we saw participation issues that I looked at the participation over a year and wondered why it was so low. I wondered why, and it was a breast cancer study, Black women were underrepresented in that trial. And the design of that study was for patients who had surgery for their breast cancer, and the standard of care after that surgery was watchful waiting. This clinical trial wanted to look at giving an oral therapy to find out, and we won't go to the details of the study, but the question was watchful waiting versus this drug therapy to find out whether or not that watchful waiting time would be longer. Well, lots of women were offered that study and plenty said no in equal numbers. So there wasn't a Black-white patient difference. There were patients who said no, that I had my surgery, my surgeon says I'm okay, my medical oncologist says I'm okay, so I'll wait and we'll watch and I'll do the follow-ups as planned, versus coming to the clinic and having visits and doing quality of life surveys and some blood draws and things that were involved in that study. Both sets of women received what is the standard of care for their breast cancer and following their surgery.
Thank you so much. That helped clarify that a lot for me.
Thank you for that question, Pam. I'd love to hear any other questions that you all have. We still have some time with Dina, and we'd love to dialogue with you about questions, or if you don't have a question, we'd love to hear what's happening in your area.
I have a question for the patient advocates, the caregivers. If you have supported a patient, a family member through a clinical trial decision, were there things that you found confusing about that process or wish the support was different for you? Would caregiver specific information have been helpful so that you could help with the decision making?
I could share some background on a patient who is in remission, if that would help.
Sure.
And through a research program, on my 71st birthday, I was awarded with the fact that I had colon cancer. So following that through, we wound up with surgery, and I found out that it was a stage 2B,
Okay.
which is not that bad, but no cancer is good. So my doctor was concerned that it had come on very rapidly following my last colonoscopy. So I was offered the opportunity for a research program, and they told me that I had an 85% chance of surviving 5 years, and that this research program would reduce that by 25%. Took me a moment to realize that 25% of 15% is a little different, but we did do it. And I was subjected to 5-FU and a vitamin to help the body accept that, and another drug that I do not remember. But we went through that with minor deviations. The only two problems that I had were that, first of all, on the first occasion of receiving the chemo, they forgot to give me the drug that would reduce the effect of it. So after they cleaned that up, they never did that again. But towards the end, they came to me one day and said, well, if you reach a point where you have difficulty buttoning your shirts, let us know. And I said, well, that's about 2 sessions ago. So they stopped that. And the only other thing that came up of note was when we started this, they gave me a hazmat material recovery kit. And I said, well, what is that for? They said, well, that is in case you spill any on the floor, you need to clean it up. And I said, you're going to put that in my veins? So we got that sorted out fairly rapidly. But in fact, when I finished all of this, that has been a long time ago. It's been basically 15 years. So whether or not that affected me in the long run, I have no way of knowing. But when I decided to do it, the thought was, if I don't do it and the cancer comes back, I'll regret it. If I do it and the cancer comes back, then I got a right to complain. So with that in mind, we finished the program, and it's been a long time ago, and I'm glad I did it.
Oh, thank you for participating. I think you have just touched on a couple things when it comes to decision making that does make it so important that when we talk to patients and their families about clinical trials, that we always come back to it being right for them. And they define that. And I think when we care for patients in a way that helps them understand that nobody knows you as well as you do. It doesn't matter what we understand about your cancer or standard of care therapies or clinical trial therapies. We can't do any of it without you. And when you are an equal participant on the care team, it means that we can have conversations about what fits best for what you want and what your idea of quality of life is. So when you said it would have bothered you if it came back and you didn't do it, I've had conversations and I've thought myself, when, to Pam's question as an example, a drug study that involves, let's say, 5-FU and a blue pill that is the latest, greatest, hope for making 5-FU work better, similar to the side effect management that you did. And one group gets the blue pill and it's the real deal blue pill and 5-FU, and one gets 5-FU and a placebo, a sugar pill. But it's blinded and you don't know which one you have. Both of them look like blue pills. If that trial was offered to me, I've always wondered what it drives me nuts not knowing what's under the Christmas tree 3 weeks before Christmas. I don't think as a patient, it would keep me up at night to not know which of the blue pills that I have. But I've cared for patients who, one that will stick with me forever was also a colon cancer patient. He really did receive the drug regimen that was FOLFOX, is the acronym for the drugs that make up that group of drugs. And the first clinical trial that I did was a phase 1 study that was FOLFOX plus a drug that's been since approved for other cancers. And it was, you got the blue pill and FOLFOX, you got FOLFOX and a sugar pill. And we had a conversation once, and he talked to a new patient thinking about the trial, and he said it would have driven him nuts if he didn't take the shot. And for him, taking the shot meant, I already know that you all are going to give me FOLFOX. I want the chance, if there's a chance, to have the new, latest, greatest, the best you've got coming. And that's how he made his decision. I mean, he also went skydiving for his 50th birthday between treatment cycles. But, so he's an adventurous guy, and I'm shaking the boxes under the Christmas tree. But we all have to decide what is going to fit in your life, because you have to be able to receive the therapy that's being offered, go on with treatment, but have a level of quality of life that makes you happy and satisfied with the decision inside a cancer center and the entire life that you're living outside of it. So there's a balance between those.
Awesome. Robert Williams has a question. Robert, feel free to take yourself off mute.
Well, hello, thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's definitely a great symposium here. My question is related to patient recruitment and enrollment. Oftentimes in my role, I experience facilities that have a limited number of clinical trials, meaning that the trials within a regimen only target specific cancer types, and of those cancer types, there are limited trials. However, websites such as clinicaltrials.gov has over 12,000 different trials, right, either open or closed. And my question is related to, is that sort of a common experience or a common protocol where certain trials are only offered at certain sites, and if there's a patient who is diagnosed, let's say, stage 3 or stage 4 breast cancer, but can't seem to find a trial that they're eligible for locally, how do we, as a society, or have we ever had any efforts to bring that trial to that patient based on their diagnosis? And just kind of curious as to know, is that something that is commonplace? Am I looking at that from a perspective where I'm thinking that there's got to be an answer for this patient, or is it something that is typical?
No, it is. When we just a little bit ago talked about distance from the patient perspective of transportation and things like that, distance is an issue that we consider as investigators when it comes to the portfolio of studies that are available in a cancer center, and whether or not people in the community can get to us, and for what reasons they can or can't get to us. So some of what you discussed, when you look on clinicaltrials.gov, some trials are offered in some cancer centers, and then those cancer centers potentially participate in a network that allows them to have community oncologists refer patients or participate in those studies themselves, so like satellite locations. But those are definitely health system issues that we are constantly looking at to try to figure out how to make the trials more accessible. So you raise a perfect point in that there are people who live in areas of the country that it would make it too challenging for them to get to the closest National Cancer Institute designated cancer center to them. And those cancer centers designated by the NCI are charged with trying to figure out how to make those trials more available. So that is one that extends outside of the cancer center. But you also raise a point that we have to constantly look at the trials that we have available when patients come to see us. So the goal would be to try to have a diverse enough portfolio of studies that there are trials available to all of the patients that we see. So I described the effort around trial candidates who decline and trying to figure out interventions to put in place that might make them more inclined to consider participating. So at least to get to the informed consent process. But part of looking at what we're doing, and really with a critical eye of how we select clinical trials that our investigators are doing in the cancer center, is also about identifying holes in that path to clinical trials. So as an example, to look at patients that we've treated with breast cancer over the last year, if I evaluate who did and didn't go on a clinical trial and why, one of the things that we found several years ago is that women with triple negative breast cancer were not going on study. Why? Because we had a portfolio of one study at the time. So the response to that was that we needed to open more triple negative trials, and making those available to the women who were coming to see us. So it is a constant evaluation, Harold, of what's happening inside in terms of how robust the clinical trial portfolio is, but how well are we partnering with other cancer centers, with consortiums that focus on particular diseases and make trials available at the community level hospitals and not just at academic cancer centers, because they are hard to get to.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you for asking that question. Dina, can we take two kind of short questions?
Yes.
We have two questions in the chat. Thank you.
No, you're not just going to let me talk and talk and talk. No, yes, we can take it.
Just two short questions. Thank you all so much. And I just want you all to know, I am going to be putting a survey in chat. If you have further questions or further topics you want to learn about, please place them on that survey so we can kind of maybe develop more of these forums or more forums related to clinical trials with Dina. And so please feel free to do that. I will be putting that in the chat shortly. So we have two questions, one from Pam Piero. How proactive should a patient be in searching for or asking about clinical trials? And then the other, Dina, is there a way to simplify some of the trial requirements? Melissa Law wants to know, for example, allowing patients to have labs drawn locally or traveling to the hospital multiple times. You kind of touched on that a little bit earlier.
I think COVID for us was a lot like looking at the sun and not being able to not see it now. And it has forced us to look at in a way that we had not before. Lots of things that we were looking at piecemeal. And that is, can you teleconsent a patient for a therapeutic clinical trial? We were not before COVID. And when we reopened those studies after COVID, there was teleconsent. We looked more critically at the clinical trial schedules that asked that a patient come in for certain blood draws. Could those be done locally? Could visits be combined for those visits that really should have been done or needed to be done by us? Because maybe it was seeing the physician or the nurse over side effect checks, so toxicity assessments, they call them, that we would do those, but not have a patient come in to do a quality of life survey, which, believe it or not, pre-COVID and for many years, there were lots of studies that a patient would come in and need to do certain quality of life related surveys or visits that really would have been more burdensome than they needed to be. So we do look more critically at those schedules and ideally before the study opens. So we are asking investigators in the reviews that we do from a patient advocacy standpoint, things like the study requirements, the readability of the consent forms that are just ridiculously long, pose challenges in and of themselves. A 30-page consent form, we know it has all the information in it that we have to share, but even sitting to read a 30-page consent form is burdensome before we get to the visits that are required. And that we consider things like those visits that we can't take off the schedule. Are you here all day? And like in our center, parking is not free. Can we put that in a study budget and try to balance some of what is burdensome to be respectful of patients and families' time? But we are looking, and that conversation is a national one, to look at what we're asking patients to do when they participate in the clinical trial. But on the other side of, before you are doing what's required in a clinical trial, we're also looking closer at how are patients deemed eligible. So what's in that inclusion, exclusion criteria? So eligible, not eligible. We look at lab values there. We look at other drugs that you may be taking because you have what they call a comorbid condition. So you have high blood pressure and you're taking blood pressure medicine for many years. There is sometimes eligibility that says you need to have a totally normal blood pressure, or we try to push that window out within the bounds of safety, but to make sure that at each of those steps, if we look closely, then that is the opportunity to make sure that trials are available to everybody who is interested in participating potentially.
Sure. And I think the last question of Pam's is a great way to kind of end and wrap it up about self-advocacy. What should patients be doing? How should we ask about clinical trials, and how proactive can we be with that as a patient or a potential participant in a clinical trial?
The asking is, in any words you choose, asking if there is a clinical trial available for you. I think it should be a conversation that happens early and often. It is one that I tell investigators and providers in our cancer center, we are pushing from that side to make sure that we are with a diverse portfolio and offering, or at least having, a discussion with every patient who has an available trial. But it's a two-way conversation. Ask any time. It is a range of potential for you to participate, even if it's not a drug study. If it's not a treatment trial and you are interested in just learning more about what you can do, the side effects, the tea tree oil thing that I mentioned, that I didn't catch his name, the gentleman that talked about his 5FU plus, there are lots of things happening that if you are interested in participating, you can find some level of risk and comfort that you that is a good match for you. But I would recommend asking every visit, if you need to find out what's happening. And it's not limited to your oncologist. Your internist may be aware of clinical trials that are happening for those folks that have hypertension or other arthritis. I mean, every single drug that we have available now has gone through the clinical trial process. And there were participants who were gracious enough and thoughtful enough to participate in those studies to make those drugs available to us. So ask about them and then question. There are lots of great education material around so that they will have prompt questions if you're not sure how to have that conversation beyond, are there clinical trials available for me, that will help get information you need and help you with the decision-making process.
That's awesome. Dina is willing to come back and do subsequent discussions for us. And so please take the time to fill out the survey so that we can really strengthen these discussions, but also bring more topics that you may want to learn about. The link is in the chat. We will also send it out to all of you by email. We thank you so much for joining. Remember that we want people to understand the different phases. We want people to ask about clinical trials at all of their doctor visits if you are interested, as well as think about some of the barriers for those of you who are patient advocates and are medical professionals. Think about some of the barriers that your patients may face and then determine ways to decrease those barriers. And please feel free to put anything in chat as we end the call. Thank you all so much for being with us. And thank you to all of you for participating.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Dina.